My name is Jonathan SARNA. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis, and it is really my great pleasure to welcome everyone to the first in a series of Schusterman Scholar Seminars. This is a little different from the series that we have had now for many years. First of all, we can't serve you lunch. Second of all, and this is what is wonderful about the new technology, we have opened this up to our fellows and to interested listeners really throughout the world. And it's a source of great pride that we in fact have people online from multiple continents. This semester, we have a very exciting group of seminars planned. You can see the list on our website. I want simply to highlight the next seminar, which will take place on the 30th of September. That is 6 days from now, because this is an experiment. For the very first time, the seminar will represent a collaboration between scholars at the Historical Society of Israel, scholars in the United States, including here at Brandeis, who will all be coming together to focus. It's very timely based on the Jewish calendar, on the saga of the Citron, historical and global perspectives. In a way, you want to come not only for the importance of the subject, but in order to see how this kind of international seminar
Jonathan, you muted yourself, I think.
Professor SARNA, you're muted.
All right, I don't know what I did to be muted. There are a lot of people who would like to mute the director, so it's not a surprise to me. I don't know how much was missed. I won't repeat it, but I will simply start from saying that I am thrilled that today, to kick off our series for this academic year, we have our good friend, Chuck Freilich. Chuck is the Goldman Senior Fellow and Lecturer in Politics at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis. Of course, he has a very long and distinguished career, both in academia and really in diplomacy. I am so very grateful to my distinguished colleague, Dr. Gary Seymour, who directs the Crown Center, for co-sponsoring and indeed for introducing and speaking with Dr. Chuck Freilich. So Gary, I turn it over to you. Let me just say, if you have questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that. And we definitely expect to have time for a few questions at the end. Gary, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well, we're really honored to welcome Chuck Freilich to Brandeis University and to the Crown Center. Chuck is a very good example of that American phenomena of a senior policymaker who successfully made the transition to academia, both teaching and writing really seminal works on Israel's national security, both the policy process, which I think no one else has really tackled as well as Chuck has, as well as the substance of Israel's foreign policy and defense and security concerns. So we're really, really delighted and honored to have Chuck with us for this semester. And like Jonathan, I want to welcome all of you from around the world. This is a great opportunity for all of us to talk about important issues that are in the news. So Chuck, let me start. The focus of our talk is on Israel's security challenges. But as with any country, especially a democracy, security starts at home. And we know in Israel, as in other countries around the world, including the United States, we really have quite a remarkable set of factors that have come together to create challenges. Some would even say a crisis domestically. So let's talk about, just spend a few minutes to set the stage, the context of security and foreign policy by talking about Israel's domestic politics and the various challenges that the government and people of Israel face.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me take the opportunity, first of all, to thank the Schusterman Center and the Crown Center, and both Jonathan and Gary personally for hosting this. It's truly a pleasure. I think, unfortunately, I will not be starting off the new year with anything optimistic to say. I think Israel is caught up in the worst domestic crisis, actually 4 interlocking crises, but the worst crises of its history, at least domestically. First of all, there is an ongoing legal/political battle. The Prime Minister's understandable attempts to stay out of jail. He's at risk. His trial gets underway seriously in January. The problem is that I think the Prime Minister has crossed the line between what is the legitimate right of every citizen to defend themselves and seems to be waging an absolutely no holds barred battle, a willingness to take the entire country down with him. And I think in the process, in the attempt to stay out of jail, and in the process, he is causing potentially irreparable harm both to Israel's legal system and its democratic system. And rather than a government of national unity, what we have at the moment is a government of national paralysis at best. The second crisis is, of course, the COVID crisis. And Israel has the dubious distinction of vying for first or second place, depends on which day of the week, in the world in the rate of infection. From a truly remarkable success story in the spring, we're now at the other extreme. And it is partly because the Prime Minister simply dropped the ball. Some people, I think, would say that it was done at least partly intentionally as part of the legal and political battle that I mentioned before. In any event, tomorrow we enter a full lockdown. The third crisis stems from the first two, and that is the worst economic crisis in Israel's history. Mass unemployment. The government seems to be shooting in all directions with no idea of what it really wants to do. It is a difficult situation. And at this point, they've used up most of the economic measures, the economic ammunition, if you will, that is available to them without causing an even more severe crisis. And fourth in this rather pessimistic litany is that there has been a severe loss in public faith in the government, in the basic legitimacy of the government. And in a situation such as that, we see a number of primary population groups, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, the Arab population, and young people generally, flaunting the regulations without any regard for their own health, but for the regulations themselves. And I think Israel is rapidly approaching the point of breakdown, severe societal tensions, potential for significant violence in the streets. And for the first time in Israel's history, I must say that I am actually quite concerned for Israel's democracy.
Wow, well, that's a pretty gloomy catalog of problems that the country faces. Although, as I said, Israel's not alone. I think throughout the world, countries are facing a combination of medical problems, economic problems, political problems. And yet the news on the foreign policy front is mainly positive, at least the recent developments in terms of Israel's agreement with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain. So let's talk a little bit about that new development. What do you see the strategic implications of these agreements in terms of the important security challenges facing Israel, from Palestine, the question of the Palestinian issue, to Iran? What kind of opportunities does this new opening with the Arab countries, Sunni Arab countries of the Gulf present? And will the Israeli government be in a position, given all the problems at home, will it be in a position to fully maximize those opportunities?
That's actually, the last point you raise is a very good question, and we'll see. Look, I think the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain are historic achievements for which in this case, the Prime Minister should certainly be commended. There were some people who tried to poo-poo it. Well, this was a long time in the making, and what kind of peace agreement with countries that you were never at war at? These are historic achievements. After 72 years, two more Arab countries, only the third and fourth, making peace with Israel. And it looks like this time, certainly the UAE, maybe Bahrain a little, but certainly the UAE is truly interested in a strong relationship with Israel, true normalization. And I can see cooperation in a variety of areas, whether it's on COVID, there's going to be they've already signed an agreement for a vaccine program, on cyber, high tech generally, even a joint space program. There's, of course, obvious room for cooperation dealing with the Iranian threat, which is the primary motivator for this, and we can come back to the Iranian threat in a moment. But there's another very important aspect to this, which is another historic change, really something of a paradigm change, which is that in recent decades, it has been accepted that the other Arab states, other than Egypt and Jordan, will not go ahead towards normalization with Israel until the Palestinian issue is resolved, or at least major progress is achieved. And that Palestinian veto, if you will, I always thought was certainly not conducive to regional peace. And I think the Palestinians have gotten another in a series of important wake-up calls that they badly need. They got a few from the Trump administration. It is time for them to change their approach because the train is either leaving or has left the station without them. And the historic opening for a two-state solution for a Palestinian state, for the Palestinians to achieve their national aspirations, if it hasn't closed, then it is very, very rapidly closing. Now, my primary concern in life isn't the Palestinians, it's Israel. It just so happens that we are two peoples fated to live together, and what happens to them has direct ramifications for Israel itself. Critical ramifications. Some people believe that the window for a two-state solution is already closed. I don't think so. I don't think there's a lot of time, but I don't think it's closed yet. And if you look today at the territory under Israel's control, Israel on the West Bank, The ratio between the Jewish and the non-Jewish population already today is 60-40. I don't know any definition of Zionism which speaks of a 60-40 ratio. Now, the Zionist movement never defined any kind of quantitative measure of what a Jewish state means. It just meant an overwhelming majority. I think most of Israel lives reasonably comfortably with the 80-20 majority that exists within Israel itself. That's a predominantly Jewish state. 60-40 isn't. So we either reach a solution in the near future or serious ramifications for Israel's future.
Chuck, let me ask you about one aspect of the Israel-UAE agreement, which was the American side sweetener to sell advanced weapons to the UAE, F-35 fighters and other weapons as well. And that created a little bit of a controversy in Israel with Prime Minister Netanyahu initially denying that he knew anything about it and that he opposed the sale, but that was quickly corrected by anonymous leaks to the New York Times that said that he was fully aware of it and did not object. And we know this week the defense minister has been in Washington, presumably seeking some package of compensation so that Israel can support the transfer of F-35s to the UAE. How much is this an issue in Israel? And I guess part of the controversy is that the defense minister says he was utterly unaware of this side deal. So that tells you something about the unity government. But what are people saying in Israel about these agreement to send more advanced weapons to the UAE, and what opportunities for Israeli-UAE defense cooperation?
I think if you look at it from a purely military perspective, then obviously this is a negative development from Israel's point of view, although there are some possibilities that I'll come back to in a minute. But just from a military point of view, this is the introduction, not just of a new weapon system, and not just even a new generation of weapons. This is an entire new kind of weapons platform that is a game changer in the battlefield. And the primary problem here may not even be the sale to the UAE, but the fact that once the precedent has been set, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and others may or probably will wish to buy the F-35 as well. Now, I think if one's talking about this as the price of peace, and this is now a platform that is being sold to a newfound friend, and a friend which is showing every signs of wanting a deep relationship with Israel, then it's a price that becomes worthwhile considering. And then if you start saying, well, there are ways, for example, of selling them a degraded version of the F-35, so it won't have quite the capabilities of the Israeli version. There are limitations, for example, on where it can be deployed only in the UAE, not elsewhere. No tankers so that it can't reach Israel. There are a variety of ways of reducing the threat. And on the other hand, as I think you were alluding to before, yes, this could be part of an array of areas of military cooperation between the two sides. And if they are both operating the same weapon systems, then you've already got the infrastructure in the UAE for doing that.
So Chuck, let's turn to, you got a great title for your, very catchy title for your talk, Rockets, Nukes, and Cyber 2. So let's take them one at a time. I mean, rockets, Israel, the main conventional threat that Israel faces on its border is the introduction of more and more sophisticated rockets in the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah. And of course, the Israeli government is making a variety of efforts to try to slow down or prevent that from happening, including attacking Iranian and Hezbollah targets inside Syria. We know periodically there are, tit-for-tat exchanges inside the Gaza Strip. So how do you assess the magnitude of this threat, the conventional rocket threat, and the Israeli government's efforts to try to deter, or if necessary, defeat that threat?
I would say that after the Iranian nuclear issue, the Hezbollah threat is the #1 threat that the state of Israel faces today. And since the Iranian nuclear threat is not an immediate one, at least for the meantime, in terms of extant threats, Hezbollah is by far the greatest danger that Israel faces. And this is, on the one hand, a comparatively small non-state actor. It should not be that great a threat. And in point of fact, Iran has, very wisely from their perspective, built it up as a dramatic threat. We're talking 130,000 rockets at least. And it's not just the quantity at this point, it's the fact that they are increasingly precise and will now be able to hit pinpoint targets in Israel. And that will enable them in the next conflict to disrupt Israel's mobilization efforts. For example, mobilization centers, weapons storehouses for the reservists who are being mobilized. It will allow them to hit critical offensive capabilities, such as air bases, and that's Israel's primary arm, to overwhelm the defensive systems, such as Iron Dome, to hit command and control, whether it's the Prime Minister's office or the General Staff in Tel Aviv, and to hit critical infrastructure, for example, power stations, water facilities, etc. So if you take both the quantitative and the specific, the precise threat, this is really a severe threat. I'll slightly overstate the case, which is that there will hardly be a building in the state of Israel that will not be hit if it's 130,000 rockets. It's a level of physical destruction that Israel has never faced. Until now, Israel's home front has always been outside of the picture. The wars were always on the border. This war is actually primarily going to be on the home front. Now, I'd rather be on the Israeli side of the border than the Lebanese side, but that's a very little comfort for anyone. The idea is to avoid wars, not to suffer a little bit less. Adding to the picture is the fact that the Iranians have been working assiduously for the last couple of years to create a direct presence of their own in Syria, a Hezbollah presence there as well, but their own military presence. And it's not just another rocket arsenal, which would be bad enough. They're trying to establish permanent air, ground, and naval bases. Now, Israel has openly acknowledged having conducted a couple of hundred airstrikes over the last couple of years, and has been reasonably successful so far in slowing down the pace of the Iranian buildup, significantly slowing it down. But let me just make up a figure. If Israel's been 90% effective, then that means that each year 10% is getting through. Well, 10% and another 10% and another 10%. And in a few years, you have another Hezbollah type situation in Syria. Only now it's one united Lebanese, meaning Hezbollah and Iranian front in Syria. That's a very, very severe threat for Israel, put it on the background of the continuing Iranian nuclear program. And it's not a good situation. Hamas is a much more limited threat. There's no comparison. On the other hand, it's much harder to deter Hamas than it is Hezbollah. And it's a low-level threat, which is constantly on the verge of erupting and is constantly disrupting and causing severe harm to the lives of the people in that part of the country.
So I've got a follow-up question on the issue of deterrence. I mean, from 2006, both sides recognized that the cost of war is extremely high. And as you said, both sides have just built up their capacity since then. And it seems to me that there's at least a pretty strong incentive on the part of both Hezbollah and Israel to avoid another war in southern Lebanon. From Israel's standpoint, because as you point out, the Hezbollah has rearmed with a much larger arsenal of more sophisticated long-range missiles. And from Hezbollah's standpoint, because Israel's made clear that the next time around, there's going to be a policy of scorched earth in southern Lebanon. So how much confidence do you have that deterrence based on the classic fear of retaliation has stabilized the risk of a war in the northern front, or do you worry about miscalculation, accidents that might get out of control and lead to an escalation and full conflict?
Absolutely. The good news is that I think that Israel has succeeded in achieving a measure of deterrence against both Hezbollah and Hamas. And people always say, well, it's very, very hard to achieve deterrence against non-state actors, and that's true. But the fact is, as you pointed out, Gary, it's 14 years of quiet, almost complete quiet on the Lebanese border. And if you had asked me in 2006 how long the quiet would have lasted, I'd have said optimistically a year or two. So yeah, there is a situation of mutually assured destruction here. But leaders miscalculate. Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, to his credit, came out after the 2006 war, and I'll paraphrase him just to be brief. What he basically said is, I blew it, and if I had known that Israel was going to escalate the way it did, I never would have started the war. So he acknowledged the miscalculation. All sides miscalculate at times. And this is literally a hair trigger situation. The distances are minute. I don't think most Americans can appreciate it. The distance between the northernmost Israeli home in the border communities and the southernmost Lebanese home is literally yards. Okay, people can look into the other side's bedroom. And when things are that close, when one soldier who maybe gets angry and fires a shot, you have a war. And that's even without the leaders intending it, and they may. And the next war, it's not just Lebanon, and it's not even just a Lebanese-Syrian front. This could escalate to Iran. Now, Iran, I believe, is the most dangerous adversary that Israel's ever faced. The Iranians are very, very sophisticated, carefully calculating players. They appear extremist or radicals to maybe to people who aren't closely familiar with what they do, but I think most Iran scholars are quite convinced of what I'm saying now. So they're very carefully calculating, much more than the Arab states ever were. They're also much bigger than most of the Arab states in population and resources. They're a relatively well-educated and a very worldly population. They are a regional superpower, and they are far away. And what that means is that I think Iran is the first adversary in Israel's history that we can't defeat. We can defend ourselves, I think, quite successfully. I sleep very well at night, but I don't think we can defeat them. They're too big, they're too far away, too powerful. And their aspirations are not friendly when it comes to Israel. I think they are dead serious when they talk about Israel's destruction. Some people think it's rhetoric. It's not. I think they have an overall strategy for how they want to make this happen. They know it's going to take a couple of decades, but that's fine. They're a fundamentalist country. They have Allah on their side, they believe, and if it takes a few decades, that's fine. So, yeah, bottom line, serious threats, and that's without talking about the nuclear issue, of course.
Well, let's turn to the nuclear issue, which is next on my list. Prime Minister Netanyahu famously opposed President Obama's nuclear deal and went all the way to Washington to try to sabotage support for the agreement. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu applauded President Trump's decision to withdraw from the agreement and turn to a policy of maximum pressure. And there's no doubt that that American policy has inflicted tremendous damage on Iran's economy. But so far, it hasn't forced Iran to agree to begin negotiations on a much more restrictive agreement, which would not only limit nuclear and missile, but also its regional activities. So from the Prime Minister's standpoint, from Israel's standpoint, where does that stand, especially with the upcoming US elections, where Vice President Biden has, of course, said that he's prepared to resurrect the agreement. If Iran restores compliance, the US will restore sanctions relief. And even President Trump has talked about a new deal with Iran. And nobody's quite sure what the terms of such an agreement would be, but there's some suspicion that President Trump is not likely to insist on the very draconian conditions that were announced when he withdrew from the agreement. So what's the view in Israel about the status of the nuclear program and the expectation that after the US elections, there's likely to be some kind of diplomatic activity, no matter who wins?
I would imagine that there's absolutely trepidation in Israel in terms of the outcome, whoever wins, whether it's Mr. Trump, who, as you're saying, he's not only repeatedly expressed a desire to reach a new deal with the Iranians, but I think in the last few weeks, it's actually become a little bit unpleasant in the sense that the president seems to be almost begging the Iranians to reach a deal. And that's not the way you negotiate from a position of strength. And of course, there's concern because the prime minister, I must say, did a remarkable job of convincing the Israeli public that the nuclear deal, the so-called the JCPOA, was a catastrophe for Israel. And so, of course, there's concern that if Mr. Biden is elected, that we'll go back to that. I personally take a very different approach towards this, which is that the JCPOA wasn't a great deal by any means. Negotiated agreements, compromise agreements, by definition are always problematic because you're making concessions to reach the agreement. And I think the US negotiating team could have done a better job. I think, frankly, they got out-negotiated. But having said that, I think that the JCPOA was the best of the bad options that existed at the time. And I still think that's the case. And unfortunately, as you know very well from your experience in the White House, in national security in general, and especially in the proliferation realm, we're usually making do with the least of the bad options as opposed to the really good ones. And this is a deal which, had it been observed, and it was being observed by the Iranians, would have given us 10 to 15 years of quiet. From an Israeli point of view, when have we ever achieved 10 to 15 years of quiet on any issue? That's always been actually an ambitious goal for Israel. And I always believe that what we should have done is waited till, let's say, the last year, we, the international community, we, primarily the United States, and come back to the Iranians and said, sorry, guys, there is no sunset clause. This thing never ends. And if you don't like it, now we'll have the crisis. I think what we see now is the failure of the Trump-Netanyahu approach after 4 years. Iran is considerably closer to a breakout capability today than it was 4 years ago. They're no more than months away from having enough fissile material for a first bomb. And yes, the maximal pressure campaign has caused them great pain. No doubt about that. But this wasn't a matter of sadism. Nobody wanted to cause Iran pain. The objective was to cause Iran to change its policies. And on that level, it's been a failure. Now, it is certainly true that 4 more years of this might be sufficient to coerce the Iranians into changing their policy. It might be sufficient to cause regime change in Iran. I think it's unlikely that either thing will happen, but cannot be discounted. Well, so far the policy has failed utterly. And we just saw an embarrassing failure of American diplomacy when it came to the attempt to extend the arms embargo in the UN, and a really inappropriate attempt to reinstate the snapback sanctions, to reimpose the overall sanctions on Iran on the basis of an agreement from which the United States withdrew. And not only the Iranians, of course, were fit to be tied over this, but the three leading American allies in Europe, France, Britain, and Germany, of course, refused to play along with this. And so, even without the Iranians doing a great deal, they managed, or the American administration managed to drive a deep wedge into the relationship with some of the closest American allies. I tend to think that Mr. Biden, if elected, is better positioned intellectually, professionally, to go back and, yes, restore the deal. And he said, but then negotiate a new follow-on deal. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the discussion that's taken place on the Democratic side, which talked mostly about going back into the deal and without the second part, the extension, and that would be to squander the leverage that the Trump administration did achieve. So that I think it should be a package in which we say to the Iranians, we're going back in, but on the condition that there are, say, 6 months for negotiating a new deal. There's got to be a timeline, because otherwise it becomes open-ended. And then the question is, what incentive the Iranians do they really have? I think they want a deal, but with the US having withdrawn and having proven, at least from their perspective, the hardliners' longstanding contention that the United States is not a trustworthy interlocutor, it's going to be really hard to get them to agree to another deal.
So we only have a few minutes before we turn to questions. I want to get to the third in your trilogy, which is cyber. And, you know, this is a classic case where a technology that could be used for offensive purposes is first developed by the most advanced countries, but pretty soon it spreads to everybody. And that's what we know about military technology in the world, is that it always diffuses. And so now Israel, which has been a leading country in the ability to use offensive cyber, finds itself the target of offensive cyber from its enemies, like Iran. So how do you see that balance of capacity in the cyber area?
I think this is an area where Israel actually has a very good story to tell on a few levels. Israel, this is remarkable. I mean, it's almost mind-boggling. Israel is a country of 9 million people, the population of New York City, and it's considered one of the top 5 cyber powers in the world, not necessarily number 5, 4, or 5. It's a cyber power both in the civil area, the commercial area, and in the military area. And that's pretty amazing. The book that I'm just about done writing about it, Israel and the Cyber Threat, presents Israel as a model that many countries can learn from. I'd say even the US has some things to learn from Israel, even though the US is undoubtedly number 1 in the world in this area. The problem is, you're right. I mean, all military technologies spread. That's the history of warfare in every area. One side gets an advantage and the other side does this and the other side does that. And it's a never-ending spiral. And your attempt is always to try and find an area of advantage and maintain it for as long as you can, but it's a constant game of back and forth. Iran is the only significant regional rival that Israel has in the cyber field. I'm saying regional because clearly Russia and China have at least probed, let's put it that way, and maybe more. And Iran is not there yet. They've come along very rapidly in the last decade, and people debate if they're still in the third rung or third tier or well into the second tier of cyber states. it doesn't matter because they're progressing very rapidly. I would say talk about the paradoxes of history. The primary impetus for the Iranian cyber program, because they weren't doing too much in this area, they hadn't woken up to it on time, was actually what is purported to be, or reported to be, the US-Israeli Stuxnet operation in 2010, the cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear program. And that's what gave them the wake-up call and got them to do what they're doing.
Thank you, Chuck. That was really, we covered a lot of territory, a lot of interesting points. Jonathan, I'm going to turn over the microphone over to you to moderate the questions. I'll mute myself.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks too to those who have sent in questions. You can continue to send them in the chat. I would say that the majority of our questions so far relate to Iran. We always give preference to our students. Molly Sidhant asked, what are Israel's policy options for dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat? And let me pair that, and then you can talk more about Iran with two other Iran-related questions. The second question from Irv Plotkin was, do you think the people of Iran are as anti-Israel as the government of Iran? The relationship between the people and the government. And the third question from Mishalom Unger is, what would be the Biden administration's realistic options? You touched on this, for re-engaging, renegotiating with Iran. So a series of Iran-related questions.
All good questions, really good questions. I want to take 1 second before I answer to say something optimistic, because I want to make sure we have enough time for me to get that in before the session ends. I don't want to leave people in a state of total depression before Yom Kippur. We've got enough to atone for as it is without my adding to the general misery. And the positive statement is that I think overall, despite all of the difficulties that I've mentioned and that I will mention in one moment, I think if you look with a perspective of 72 years of Israeli independence, Israel's national security strategy has been a truly dramatic success. Today, Israel, or at least before the COVID crisis, was a prosperous and still is, I believe, an established and essentially secure state. Now, when I say essentially secure, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of severe threats. There are, but I don't think there are any existential threats anymore, and will not be unless Iran goes nuclear. And I believe that we can handle that if, God forbid, it happens. There are no significant conventional threats anymore. The two primary conventional threats, Syria and Iraq, have for all purposes ceased to exist. The WMD threats have been reduced or postponed. Ben-Gurion famously said back in the 50s that if and when Israel had a Jewish population of 5 million, which was a totally unimaginable number at the time, its existence would be ensured. And well, we crossed the 7 million point a couple of years ago. So I think Israel won its existence. And that is truly wonderful and remarkable news. And now the question is what kind of existence we have, and that's at least significantly in our hands, not entirely. So there's good news to counterbalance the overall gloomy picture. But now let me turn to the questions about Iran. First of all, just quickly about the people of Iran. I think most people in Iran are like people everywhere. They get up in the morning and they want to send the kids to school. They want to go to work. Most of them have tired of the down with Israel, down with the United States rhetoric decades ago. Most people in Iran would be quite happy to put this behind us. There is some minority, no, I don't think anybody knows what the actual number is. I don't know if it's 20%, 30%, but I think that's the order of magnitude of people who are still committed to the revolutionary ideals of the revolution. And they have a very, of course, a very, very negative approach towards Israel. Most people, I think, are quite open both to Israel and especially to the United States. The question is, what are Israel's options for dealing with the nuclear program? Well, the preferred option, everyone prefers, I believe, is a diplomatic resolution. The question is whether we can achieve it. It's going to be very, very hard. Iran has you have to understand where they're coming from, okay? If you want to deal with an adversary, you have to understand what motivates them. Iran has very, very good strategic reasons for wanting a nuclear capability. If we were Iranian strategists, we'd want it also. That's why they haven't been willing to forgo it. They've been willing to postpone it, all sorts of things, but not to forgo it. So how do you get them to agree to a diplomatic agreement today when they no longer, to the extent that they ever trusted the US, they don't trust the US today? They've got their own domestic politics, which make things very hard because Mr. Trump's withdrawal proved, quote unquote, proved the case of the hardliners. And they are deeply afraid that the United States wants to topple their regime. Now, the Iranian regime defines itself as the embodiment of the divine word on earth. That's quite a self-definition. And if there's somebody who's threatening the regime, that they're threatening God himself. The only thing that they believe guarantees the future of the regime is a nuclear capability. So whether Mr. Biden can really, this is the last question, whether Mr. Biden can really reach a new agreement, we'll see. But if we can't reach a negotiated settlement, well, sabotage has achieved a fair amount of time, whether it was the 2010 Stuxnet attack that brought a year or two, the recent attack on the Natanz enrichment facility, which has been attributed to Israel correctly or not. This one is thought to have gained a little bit more, maybe 2 or 3 years. I think we can keep playing for time doing things like that, but it's hard to really sabotage a program in the final sense of the word. The Iranians are seem to be willing to live with the pain of sanctions. That's not open-ended, but they certainly have some more time. I don't believe that you can foment regime change from the outside without getting to really, really extreme pressures, and we're not there. And it's questionable whether we can actually achieve that level. So just through a process of elimination, you end up coming down in the end to the military option. I believe that if and when all of the non-military options have been used up, and we're not there yet, we've got at least a couple of years, if not more, and somehow we always gain more time. I believe that when the actual crunch comes, Israel has no choice but to go military if the US doesn't do so. I don't think we'll gain very much time. I think the blowback will be severe. I just think that the danger to Israel of a nuclear Iran is such that we cannot allow it to happen. And I say that even though in the end, if, again, God forbid, if Iran does go nuclear, Israel's got deterrent capabilities of its own. And if we have to, we can live with that situation through mutually assured destruction. It'll be a very bad situation because the Middle East is very different from the US-Soviet or the Indo-Pakistani nuclear balances, much less stable. I would definitely not want to live under those circumstances, but we have no choice. We can do that too.
Well, did you want to say more about the upcoming presidential election in the United States and its impact? What might be the result, for example, of a Biden victory? He's well known in Israel. Do you want to say more about that in terms of your topic?
Well, I think I addressed the primary points. Clearly, Biden is going to want to go back to the deal and achieve a new deal, a follow-on deal. Well, Trump, as I said before, not only wants, but is creating the impression that he's almost begging for a deal. So from that point of view, there isn't a fundamental difference. I think Mr. Biden is far more qualified to negotiate effectively. I remind you that Mr. Trump famously or infamously fell in love with the leader of North Korea, who is, of course, a very lovable character, but I would still question the president's affections in this case. And I would be afraid that he might fall in love with the supreme leader as well. And in his desire to reach a deal, in itself a fine aspiration, but maybe also motivated by the desire to get a Nobel and to go down in history and things, might be willing to sell out the store. And as I said before, I am concerned about at least some currents of thought on the Democratic side of people who just say, well, let's go back to the JCPOA and everything's wonderful. And that's not true. The JCPOA will expire, or the primary part of it expires just over 5 years after a Biden administration might come into office. And 5 years is very little. So is it really worth doing just for 5 years? Well, if there's a follow-on agreement, the answer is yes. Just 5 years? Questionable, okay? I don't discount 5 years either, but it's just 5 years.
So people have enjoyed your presentation so much that we've had questions concerning Turkey and Israel. We haven't mentioned Turkey. We've had questions concerning China and India. And we've had questions about the role of Russia and what kind of an influence does it play. So in the last 4 minutes or so, do you want to say anything about some of the other countries that have strong interests in the Middle East?
1 minute for each of the four. I think that Turkey is in many ways, well, it's becoming a major threat to Israel and may ultimately prove to be an even greater one than Iran. Mr. Erdogan is another one of those leaders who I will not characterize, but my affections are limited. He last year expressed a desire to potentially achieve a Turkish nuclear military capability. He has risked a rift with Turkey's longtime historic superpower ally, the United States, a rapprochement with Russia. We almost had American and Turkish forces, NATO allies firing on each other in Syria. If Turkey actually develops a military nuclear program, note that the Begin doctrine, the doctrine according which says that Israel will prevent any hostile actor in the Middle East from achieving a military nuclear capability if necessary by force. Well, Israel implemented that towards Iraq in '81, Syria '07. So far, not against Iran. Maybe that will happen, yes or no. But the next on the proliferation list, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they all happen to be American allies. Turkey is a NATO ally, so that the prospects for being able to implement the Begin doctrine against Turkey are, shall we say, questionable. And Turkey's got a really big military and no sense of humor at all when it comes to their national security. China was not a major player in the Middle East until very recently, other than on an economic level as a huge importer of oil. But it didn't really play diplomatically, militarily. it would usually passively support or usually support the Russian position in the Security Council. That's slowly been changing, and in the last month or two may have begun changing dramatically with this deal that they just signed with Iran. It hasn't been fully worked out yet. There's still at least some elements that are under negotiation. But we're talking about something like a $400 billion deal for 25 years. Much of it is commercial and okay, but it also has unspecified military dimensions to it, whether it's apparently major arms supply and areas of strategic cooperation. And by the way, cyber potentially also. India is a good ally of Israel's, long-standing, very good relationship there the last couple of decades. Russia, Israel's got a very mixed relationship with Russia. On the one hand, Russia is Iran's, or at least until now, Iran's primary backer, the primary backer of the Assad regime, primary source of information, of weapons for both countries. So you can say on the one hand, clearly a very negative player from Israel's perspective, but the truth is those policies are very negative from Israel's point of view, but they're not directed against Israel. They stem from Russian strategic interests that are independent of Israel. And at the same time, we have a very good bilateral relationship. And Mr. Putin does, upon occasion, seem to demonstrate consideration for Israel's needs. I think he even has, this is a guy who doesn't seem to show a lot of emotion in his conduct of national security policy. I think he actually has some feeling for Israel. And he and Mr. Netanyahu have developed a very good relationship. So there's a bit of sort of two different trends here. And given the fact that the United States has largely disengaged from Syria, and Syria or Iran in Syria and Hezbollah in Syria have become such a major threat for Israel, actually our best hope at this point for preventing a severe deterioration on the Syrian front is with Russia. Again, talk about the paradoxical changes in history that we have to rely on Russia today because the US isn't really playing very effectively.
All right. Really quite remarkable that you've been able to give us this global tour, a true tour de force. I want to speak for everyone here in thanking you for this presentation. I apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to. And let me again remind everyone that next Wednesday on September the 30th, you can join us for really a international conference entitled The Saga of the Citron. How you study a little etrog, a little citron, and learn about its historical and global perspectives. We have an all-star cast of 8 different scholars, and I think it will be a not-to-be-missed program. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to my colleague Gary Seymour, and thank you, Chuck Freilich. Shalom.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.